The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners around the world on radio streaming and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for navigating the madness of mental health using my top 10 sayings for checking in with your best self. This episode, we're continuing our look at why smart people do dumb things. Last week, we talked about dumb self-talk. This week, we're looking at ego. Ego. A word with so many interconnected meanings. Colloquially, it's usually meant as a pejorative. If we say someone has an ego, it means they're unpleasantly full of themselves. We refer primarily, of course, to the male ego. And I'll have an expert on navigating manhood on with me later. Jeff Perera of higherunlearning.com will be joining us to discuss alternatives to the male ego trap. Because ego has another meaning in psychology. Now, unclench your cheeks, folks. I'm not going to do a deep dive into Sigmund Freud here. The ego in Freudian psychoanalysis is your conscious mind, your rational thoughts, whereas your id, saith Freud, is your instincts and primal drivers. Then you've got the superego, which is essentially your morality, but let's not overcomplicate things because, well, Freudian stuff is kind of falling apart. For decades, the belief was that the ego must keep the id in check, but we're finding increasingly that neglecting those instincts leads to a lack of fulfillment, especially in trauma work. Paying attention to one's instinctual responses is important for redeveloping a sense of safety and control. And the idea that our conscious minds are purely rational is also wrong, which is why I think the meaning of ego shifted in popular usage. I remember doing this contract job for a marketing company, and the head of the company sat in on a meeting. For some odd reason, he decided to target me in that meeting. He kept insisting that the people we were creating content for were the guy in the chair, and they had big egos. He kept saying, put yourself in the chair, put yourself in the chair. Thing is, our clients were 80% female, and they were a bank. Bankers don't have that sort of ego. Bankers have spreadsheets. But the project took on comic proportions as the boss hijacked the entire thing and decided to produce a script with a bunch of Toronto Raptors references in it. He didn't seem to realize that the Raptors were sponsored by a different bank. As you can imagine, the client wasn't exactly pleased. That's the thing about that kind of ego. People with big egos can't put themselves in other people's mindsets. They assume absolutely everyone thinks like them. Those of us that follow the science know that's not true, so we try to limit assumptions regarding motivations. What projects to the world as someone being full of themselves is usually a fence keeping in all their not-so-hidden insecurities. When you're secure in yourself, you can accept and validate different points of view. You don't badger someone in a meeting to put yourself in the chair, because if you're taking your own advice, you realize that person likely doesn't enjoy being grilled by the boss like that in a group meeting. It's uncomfortable, not just for the person the boss is targeting, but everyone in the meeting. And this is an example. Head of a company, smart guy, right? Doesn't matter how smart you are if your ego gets in the way of your good sense. But having that ego-driven swagger is still seen as confidence in many business and social circles. It's really the exact opposite of confidence, and it leads to terrible decisions. But having some ego is actually a good thing. So, how do we know how much is too much? Well, like many psychological issues, disorders are diagnosed by whether something is negatively impacting your life. The problem with the unchecked ego set, though, is that nothing is ever their fault. They never realize there's a problem. They wreck the lives of the people around them, and they themselves aren't happy. But it's always everybody else's fault. I still don't quite understand why we put these egotistical jerks up on cultural pedestals. This idea that bullying is strength, recklessness is decisiveness, they're so out of date. They're not helping us individually or collectively. But the minute we start challenging any of these things in a public square, someone screams that we're being anti-men. But here's the thing. That performative masculine ideal is connected to some pretty lousy statistics. The suicide rate is at least 3 times higher for cisgender men than cisgender women in every adult age category. And because I checked, according to data from the Trevor Project, young transgender men are also more likely than young transgender women to consider and attempt suicide. Other studies of transgender people have shown that suicide risk in transgender women decreases with time in treatment, but the risk doesn't decrease for trans men. Then there's the violent crime rates. Men are both more likely to commit violent crime and be the victim of violent crime. And injury and disease mortality have such a gender gap that, according to one data set I looked at, even though more boys are born around the world than girls by a tiny little bit, by the time people reach 65 years old, there are only 75 men for every 100 women. This allows us to theorize that those constructs of masculinity, that male ego thing, causes a lot of smart men to do a lot of dumb things. And for you guys whose egos haven't been able to handle the last 2 minutes, don't worry. We're doing women and imposter syndrome next week. This is probably a good time to throw out the contact information if anything inspires a question, comment, or suggestion. Liana at nottherapyshow.com is my email, or you can go to nottherapyshow.com, fill out the contact form there, join our mailing list while you're there, or Not Therapy Show on X, that's Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. I enjoy Threads, even though there's not very much to do there. We'll be back after this break talking with Jeff Perera, talking the male ego. Jeff is a little more chill, a lot more chill than I am on this subject. Jeff's great. We'll be back with him after the break on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. And it's time for the interview. I have somebody I like a lot with me this show. I've got Jeff Perera with me since 2008. Jeff Perera has been talking to audiences across North America about helpful versus harmful ideas of manhood, building bridges across our differences, and men helping end gender-based violence. You can check out Jeff at higherunlearning.com. He's available to speak at your community campus or space. And Jeff is here to talk to us about ego. Jeff, where do you start when you're talking to notably men? But I do think there is a female version of this, but we'll start with where people know. Where do you start unpacking the concept of ego and how it drives our thinking?
Well, Liana, first of all, it's great to be with you, and it's thankful to be here with you for this conversation. You know, when we talk to men and young men about anything when it comes to manhood and masculinity, not all men, but a number of men get into kind of a fight, flight, or freeze mode. You know, because manhood is so much about, it's this whole thing around the perception of who you are versus the reality. It's about performance, you know, that we're being measured as men, but what we can demonstrate, what we own, what we produce, you know. So thinking about our identities, um, and how they're shaped so much by social influences, and that, so much of in this day and age we exist more socially sometimes, like online versus in person. So our ideas of who we are, self, the definitions of my identity, my worth, so the male ego becomes a big part of this conversation, thinking about how um society shapes our ideas of who we are, our value, our worth, and we internalize this kind of programming as to, this is how I demonstrate or prove my worth. So it's a conversation that, when men find a space to actually talk about it, they warm up to the conversation. They're excited to talk about it. But even within having the conversation itself, it's kind of like the dance between how I talk about this and how I open up and share amongst my peers, my colleagues, because the piece around being authentic, being humble, uh, being vulnerable is such a challenge for us as guys in general. So opening up and talking about and naming and identifying and talking about ego can be such a challenging thing, because it's really, it's looking in the mirror and not looking to see how are people perceiving me, but what's actually really there, what's really going on. So it's it's kind of like, for old school folks, it's kind of like when you get out the Christmas lights and you have to untangle them, and you're trying
Mhm.
to find which light bulb isn't working. That's a lot of what this conversation really is.
Now, you touched on the actual technical Freudian psychoanalysis dynamics definition of ego in the sense of identity, that
Mm,
constructed part of your identity, and how you uniquely in flux it is for men right now. And that's, I mean, that's a very real thing. And yet there's, I mean, there's a lot being made to complicate it. And I think that's actually making things more difficult for young
mm,
men than less in terms of that untangling. I mean, this is where we get into the, big word for a simple thing, normative male alexithymia.
mm,
The idea of alexithymia is just difficulty putting emotional experience into words. They touch on that in all things in the Barbie movie.
mm,
And I was very impressed by that. But the idea that men have these feelings, they're not taught to process the feelings. And I mean, women are not taught to process certain feelings either. It's just sort of like pretend they're not there, and they don't even have a name for it. And
mm,
that's where that constructed personality identity comes from. Now, when you start getting into questions of identity versus performance, which you mentioned,
mm,
it's very hard to know where the line is when you're
mm,
discussing. And I think that's where a lot of this backlash against talking about this stuff comes from, is people feel like their identity is under threat when people are just talking about how you express yourself. And this is where we get into that fraud idea of toxic masculinity. Do you want to touch on where that's going, what you're seeing in the work you do regarding the concept? Because some guys hear that term and believe it's saying all masculinity is toxic. Is that true?
so much of our conversation is so divisive, and trying to find, ways to have a conversation where we all drop our armor and lower our guard and kind of really open up and talk about it. Even just intellectual, having conversation, having discussion, it's become the new, let's take this outside. It's like the debate bro culture, right? So
Yeah.
even having the conversation about the conversation can be really challenging. And yeah, like I personally don't use the phrase toxic masculinity, um, because it's become so loaded, like the people's concepts or understanding of the word is enters the room before my actual
Right.
intention, right? But I think when you talk about intention, one of the challenges is, if my intention is good, it's how I show up for the impact, like how I impact the room, how my words land. If my intention is good, I'm going to show up for when my intention didn't work out. So it's thinking about the words I'm using, and as much as I can trying to meet the mark. I think that, if if I say that, I don't like my hamburger raw, I like it cooked to some degree. I'm not saying I hate hamburger.
Right.
And thinking about masculinity as something that can become helpful in society, helpful towards ourselves, or it can become harmful. I have this quote from the great Buddhist speaker Pema Chodron on my wall. It says, "The most fundamental aggression to ourselves, the most fundamental harm we can do to ourselves, is to remain ignorant by not having the courage and the respect to look at ourselves honestly and gently." And I think
Mhm.
about how it is a time where men are trying to figure out who we are in the world, what's our value, what's our worth, like who are we? And we're seeing that especially with young men and boys. But I think it's being able to look in the mirror, face hard truths, thinking about, well, who do I want to be and not want to be, and how these ideas of manhood, are they lining up with the person I want to be? Or are they taking me in a different direction? And it's really hard when you don't have role models,
Mhm.
examples, models of possibility. In your own personal life, or what you're seeing through social media, online, in your community. So having access to someone where you can talk about what it is to kind of like just navigate relationships, not even romantic, sexual, just friendships,
Mhm.
work dynamics, being online with your friends, being in the classroom, being in the lunchroom, the boardroom, because you're trying to figure it out on your own. This whole idea of manhood is that you're supposed to know. You don't ask
Right.
questions, right? You just, you need to have game. You need to know what you're doing, and the ability to kind of exhale and say, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what this looks like. And then, you end up looking either to people who are genuinely with you, like, yeah, I'm with you. Let's try to figure this out together. Or people who are going to tell you, this is the way forward. This is what you need to do. And a lot of those voices, um, so-called, self-help voices, and uh, just people, I would say, pulling us back into outdated ideas of manhood.
Mhm.
This era we're in is kind of like, we're all in survival mode, and it's like we're in stormy waters, and some of us are trying to find solid ground, and some of us are retreating back to what we know, or what feels familiar. So in stormy waters, this harmful idea of being a man feels more solid, more rigid. It
Mhm.
it comes with the face of like the scolding father figure, like I mean, these names, we keep talking about them, like Jordan Peterson, or someone like Andrew Tate, who's projecting this idea, and it feels like this is a way forward. This is my life jacket. So um, the real challenge is how ego gets in the way, sometimes, with all this, with this conversation that we're having.
Yeah, I mean, you just cited two examples to me of, walking egos, very different ego constructs, but
Mm,
both, clinging to this false certainty. Because when I watch one of their videos, yes, I
mm,
watch them. I'm
mm-hmm,
so sorry. But I see one guy using the structures of academia to maintain a very ego driven um persona that I see a lot of insecurity and fear
mm-hmm,
there. I mean, when someone is shaking and crying in lectures, anywhere else that would be considered something's really wrong here. But that's
mm-hmm.
become part of Jordan Peterson's brand. And that's the thing that people don't see if they see him on um uh, his daily whatever it is videos, or
Mm.
there's the structured thing, and then there's, I mean, we'd call him a hot mess, but it's almost like he's giving space to cry, to shake, to tremble, to have those things going on, feel those feelings, and then deny it was anything. Order, structure, clean your room, don't bother kids when they're skateboarding. Right.
Mm.
Then you've got Tate, who just seems to me like a tiny little boy in a muscle suit with a lot of mouthy words. I mean, I kept thinking of Andrew Tate watching the Kens in the Barbie movie. It was so performative. They didn't know what they were doing. Their entire reason for being existed putting women up on pedestals. And now they got this moment of, wait a minute, this isn't fulfilling. So now we have to treat women badly.
Yes.
And that seems very clear to me, but obviously the young men that flock to these guys, it's not clear to them. They see these guys as having their ish together.
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, I think that when, you and I look at someone like Andrew Tate, we right away can see this is a grifter, a con artist. This is performative. When Tate first kind of hit the public scene, he was a mixed martial arts fighter, and he was in the UK, he was on Big Brother,
right?
Which, is a juggernaut over there. Like, it was big here, but it is a cultural juggernaut over there. And when he was on the show, he was spoken over, he was mumbling, he was just this guy in the corner. And, that person that we saw in this reality show, I thought that reflected a lot of his future fans, like young men who feel they're not being heard, they're being stepped on. And so, the story came out that he had been physically violent towards a woman. He was kicked off the show. And then all of a sudden, fast forward, he's created this public persona that is this, like, lion in a cheap suit with a cigar, hiding behind sunglasses, yelling and screaming at people. And I think that, the appeal, I think, for young men and boys, I think they know that he's a con, and that's what they love about him. They love the act, right? Because if the society's idea of manhood is about performing, pretending, like as men we're actors trying to be something we're not, it's all about the con, right? So the first person that you're fooling is yourself, and then you're fooling others, right? So I think that they love that Andrew has, in their mind, perfected the con. Like, he's so great at it. Like, he's got this Bugatti, he's in this mansion, and and he looks physically intimidating. He holds the room when he speaks. And if you saw him on Big Brother, you're like, this is like night and day who this person is and the person we're seeing now. So I think that's part of it. I think part of the appeal is, he's like us, but he figured out how to play the role. And I don't want to necessarily improve and get better. I just want to put on the projection that I'm this person.
Okay. So it's a quick fix.
Right. Again, it's like you're struggling in the water, you're drowning. Here's your life jacket, versus learning how to swim. Grab Andrew Tate, like, boom.
Right.
Simple.
Yeah. Quick. I mean, it's just so, it's real easy to dismiss what is going on there, but he captured something. And that's, I mean, I think when we talk about these figures, we invert the problem. These are, this is going to sound horrible, but these are opportunistic infections. Jeff, hang on. We're going to take a break. We're going to pause with Jeff Perera of higherunlearning.com. Jeff will be back with us a little more after the break when we return on It's Not Therapy, talking the male ego. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana. I'm still not a therapist. We're still in the interview talking to Jeff Perera of higherunlearning.com. Now, before the break, we were talking Andrew Tate. Ego versus actual healthy identity, like being centered in yourself versus, flying high on this construct that, like I said, it's a muscle suit.
Hmm.
I keep hearing from young men that they're terrified by this idea that their intentions don't matter, only the results. And I hear that, usually college age, it gets drummed into them in college that your intentions don't matter, only your results matter.
Mm,
So if somebody says you're a bad thing, then you are automatically a bad thing. Now,
mm,
some people do say that. I also think there is something of a misunderstanding there, and you explained it better off the top. So I want to circle back to make sure that point really hammers home. Because what you did when you talked about intention is you said that if, I'm going to the room with a certain intention and I'm going to put that into practice if my message doesn't land the way I intend.
mm,
And that to me was modeling what we can either say healthy self-concept or healthy ego. The construct, the rules you've set up for yourself is, if I understand it, you can tell me if I'm right. I know I have good intentions.
mm-hmm.
Nobody can tell me what my intentions are. The best way to communicate my intentions is if something doesn't go my way, hold up, what happened? And you're secure enough in yourself to take that
Mm,
feedback instead of it
mm-hmm.
destroying you and the entire house of cards fumbling. How'd I do there?
That's yeah, bingo.
Okay.
Bullseye. Yeah, I think that, I talk a lot about the power of a pause. For me, a pause is an opportunity within any moment to reclaim and refine your reaction to the moment,
Hmm.
right? So you take that pause. I have good intention. I'm a good person. I'm a good man, and in a
Mm-hmm.
world of and not giving away anything in the Barbie film, but the messaging to men is that, you're not enough. You're not enough. You're not you need to be better, do better. And for men and young men, it's like, I am a good person. I'm a good guy.
Mm-hmm.
So the other challenge is, on top of that, at an early age, we learn that our value is in being able to solve problems.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the problem. I'm the solution. Right. It starts with, like, with kids, like parents with their kids, like they might ask the boy to do the thing or to take on the responsibility,
Right.
and as they get older, they're like, take it, watch your sister, like, and do these different things. And those messages kind of, they evolve and grow. And so men become coded in thinking, my role is to be a fixer. I
Mm-hmm.
need to fix, versus I need to help. How can I help? How can I serve? You walk in the room, it's like, how can I give? How can I help? And that feels weak. It feels like you're not being the solver.
Hmm.
You're being this kind of like, oh, that's why I think, like, a lot of men don't volunteer. I think that
Huh.
we see volunteering as like, it's not leadership. I need to fix, I need to be the leader. But valuing the role I play as a helper, right? Like, that is where the value is.
Mm-hmm.
The leader is useless if there's people not taking action and actually doing the thing,
Yeah.
like. And I think, to kind of get back to what you're saying, like, I think that once you put all those things, like, you put those things in the pot and you're looking at it, you realize that for men, like, yes, like, good intention, but the humility to be able to kind of step back and see ourselves. Because if you, like, another, I'm quoting a lot of Buddhist folks here, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about, if you love something or someone, but you don't know how to love,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, I love this plant. I'm going to keep watering it and watering it. And then, oh, I drowned it,
Mm.
or, and then you extend that to relationships. Like, I really love my friend. I love my partner. And you might do things that end up pushing them away or harming the connection, and not even seeing it, you know?
Yeah.
So I think that, it's humility is such a big part of this. And it's so hard when you're trying to, like we talked about at the beginning, this balance between trying to have this positive sense of self, but how that can blend into, oh, I've got this figured out, like,
Mm-hmm.
I worry about people's perception of me, like, oh, here comes the evolved male to tell me how I'm such a or I'm sorry,
Right.
I'm such a horrible person,
Hmm.
right? And it's like I try to deflate that right away. Like I'm not an expert. I'm just a guy trying to figure it out. It's like you remember back in the day when I'm sure people still use pen and paper in school, but there was always the kid in class that took the great notes.
Right.
You're probably this kid, like took really good notes and also added their own notes and little diagrams and like used different markers and stuff like that. Like I tried to be that kid, and you want to borrow that person's notes if you miss class. Like I try to think of myself like I'm trying to be that person. I'm not the teacher, I'm a student, but I'm taking good notes
Hmm.
and I'm willing to share them with people. So I think if we reframe it where, you know, the ego telling me like I need to be the solution, it's like, no, I just need to, how am I helping myself? How am I helping people in this situation? How am I serving myself, serving others, and
Hmm.
are that as being the good student who's listening and observing, taking notes. How could this be different? How could I do better? um Not be better, but how could I do better? Like
Right.
it's not telling men to do better, do better, do better. I think it's inviting men and young men to kind of imagine what could be better. Like how could this be different? Is this
Yeah.
working for me? So yeah.
Yeah, it's funny that thing you said about the mindset of fixing versus mindset of helping was really interesting. I mean, the version on this show, Power of the Pause, is listen twice before you talk once,
mm.
because I think too many people listen to respond instead of
Mm-hmm.
listen to understand. And my version of listen twice is, okay, what did the person say? No, what did they really say? Not
Nice.
what I'm afraid they meant. What did they really say?
Love it.
But then the fixer versus helper, I mean, that was another thing they touched on in the Barbie movie. And it was a moment I actually felt bad for the Kens. Because
mm.
I work with a lot of men, I know that explanation, what the over explaining, the quote unquote mansplaining. And
Mm.
like you, I try to avoid using terms like mansplaining, toxic masculinity, except as a joke,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
because that desire to fix things, to be useful, is a real driver. And this is part of the reason I wanted to talk about male ego, because it's this, oversimplified, oh, ego is always bad. No, we
Mm-hmm.
all have a conscious part of ourselves that, like, who do we want to be, right? What is our morality? That's more the super ego. But this idea of who we are, how we fit in society, and being useful is how a lot of boys and young men, like you said, do develop the very shaky beginnings of self-worth.
Mm.
The problem with that, the achievement driven self-worth, is it falls apart the minute
Mm-hmm.
you're not achieving. And there are times in our life where we're all stuck.
Mm-hmm.
Things just aren't moving, things aren't coming together. It's just bad luck. A lot of people are looking for work right now. A lot of people, their
Mm.
money is not going as far as it used to, and they're feeling less worthy, less enough, because of circumstances way beyond control, because
Mm-hmm.
they can't get those achievements, they can't fix things. And that's when I think ego trips us up. And
Mm-hmm.
it's the whole idea, the I am Kenuff is now an internet meme.
Yep. Yep.
But some people are, I am Kenuff, when they heard I saw the movie. Oh, you saw it? No, I saw the meme. uh but people dismiss that, and it's frustrating that that became part of the marketing, because in the context of the movie it's actually quite sweet.
Yes, right.
And the this idea of, I can be a part of my community, I can volunteer, I can contribute. I think contribute is maybe better than fix, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because another thing we say on this show is, be the hero of your own story and not anyone else's.
Nice.
And working in male dominated industries, tech, TV, especially comedy, it was this constant power struggle with everybody trying to be top dog. Now, of
Mm-hmm.
course, I got a very different reaction to trying to be top dog than guys did, because it was expected of guys. I was shoved into this. Well, you can take notes, right?
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I had one guy throw $10 in my lap once, and tell me to buy him lunch. I outranked him on the set. And
Oh.
did anybody say anything to him? No. And at the
Mm-hmm.
time, I thought, well, this is patriarchy, but no, it was a bunch of guys not knowing what to do.
Yep.
There's no script for what other guys do when a guy does that. And it's structural, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way men socialize, the way men communicate, it's all parallel. It's all,
Mm-hmm.
let's go play hockey, or let's go play basketball, or let's do a common activity. And so no one wants to rock the boat and say, hey, I'm not sure about how this is going. And the authenticity saps away and saps away and saps away. That sense of what a guy wants dwindles and dwindles. And then it's all just, oh, that was a joke, I'm supposed to laugh, right?
Mm-hmm.
It hit a pinnacle in the whole locker room talk debacle.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's an example of something that I don't know of a single guy that likes that. And I don't know of a single guy who doesn't put up with it.
Mm-hmm.
What is going on there?
Yeah, there's, another way to think of it is kind of like, you know, the challenge. Like I always talk about how it's the challenge of we're being asked to see what seems invisible,
Mm-hmm.
and that seems impossible. What are you talking about, right? Um, I, for example, if you talk about tech culture, imagine a startup and it's a group of young men, and so think of it like it's a pool of water, or
Mm-hmm.
the temperature in the room, or the temperature feels fine for those, let's say, five guys, right? They have great camaraderie and it's a great energy and a great dynamic and it feels
Mm-hmm.
good. And then a client visits the space,
Yeah.
or a woman, or a trans person, a woman of color, etc. Someone outside of that enters the space, and for them the temperature feels cold,
Right.
or it's too hot, right? It feels cold, it doesn't feel inviting, or it's too hot. This feels like, oh, and for everyone in the space, they're like, what's their problem? The
Yeah.
temperature feels fine to me, So that's the challenge, is how to get to that place where you understand what's going on, and
Mm-hmm.
that it's not a simple. People want this is a day and age of hit a button, give me the simple answer.
Yeah. Give me a guarantee.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah. Yeah.
no, it's a journey. It's a journey of yourself and in your space to figure out what are we doing, what could be done differently.
Yeah.
And again, it's tough because the way men receive these messages is it's all about measurement. You
Yeah.
know, like, I'm not good enough, I'm not strong enough, my body part's not big enough, my car's not big
Right.
enough, it's not good enough.
Another
Versus,
body part's too big.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So it's such a challenge to kind of put that aside and be like, okay, this isn't personal, even though I need to make it personal. But it's thinking about what needs to be done, what can be done differently here.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and that's not easy, And I think we need to give each other grace to kind of recognize, you know, turning it around, the ocean liner. Like it's
Yeah.
the process. It's not going to
Yeah.
happen overnight. Like it's like we want men to improve. It's like, okay, you're going to learn to run a marathon after a week. It's like,
Right.
that's not happening.
Yeah, yeah.
And
That
so,
I've identified that as an issue too, that men don't have space to practice doing things differently. It,
right,
the
right.
minute they and women have a part to play in this as well. This whole men policing men thing leaves out a huge thing for me. And what
Mm,
we should have you back on to talk about this sometime, because it's its own topic. But men realize, okay, I got to make a change. Their ego is diminished. And so they don't have the step by step of how to do things. The heuristics disappear. And so everything takes more work for a while. And
mm,
and then they go back into their lives and their wife gives them a negative reaction. when they try to express an emotion
Yes.
awkwardly, perhaps too aggressively, that too much, not enough thing.
Yes.
And they retreat because it's so painful and so humiliating. Then you've got the reactants. Then they're on the internet watching Jordan Peterson
Jordan
and Andrew Tate
Tate.
videos.
Oh God.
Jordan Tate, he's the Voltron. Yeah. But that's the thing, is that it is unpopular to attempt to understand the way ego fits into this stuff. But we're
Yes.
not going to do things differently if we can't name the various components
Right.
of the dynamics of what's going on here. And unless guys have a place to make mistakes and it not be the end of the world, not have their identity attacked because the performance was off, we're not going to move that ship. How do you begin that process knowing it's going to be rough at first? This is not easy.
No, it's not. I think it's, when we, as men, we have a goal, say for example, my physical state. I want to be in shape. I want to be able to play, rec hockey on the weekend, or, what have you. You have that goal, you decide to go to the gym.
Right.
You get a personal trainer. You know that if you're doing it right, 48 hours later, like you're working your core muscles, you're working your glutes. 48 hours later, I'm going to be in pain.
Yeah.
Right. It's going to be sore. And it's a good looking, and you learn to look forward to the burn of that. But if we're building our emotional being, like our emotional muscle, as I describe it, like, you need to learn that it's going to be hard work, and there's going to be pain. Right. That whole no pain, no gain kind of thing. But the reality is, like, if I'm building up, my emotional being, it's building, reawakening atrophied muscles, building new muscles that haven't been worked. Like, a lot of guys, not a lot, but a number of guys, typically they work their upper body. So you see guys all like from the waist up, they're like Hulk Hogan, but then they have scrawny legs, right?
Yeah, the whole skip leg day meme.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think about this a lot because especially during the pandemic, I was very sedentary. So my knees are really shot right now. And I'm working on kind of building the strength in my knees, and I think a lot about, for example, like right now I have a hard time kneeling. If I had to get down on the floor and kneel, like my knees are in such pain, like I really have to build the muscle, and my meniscus around there is really tender and all that because I'm a big boy. And so my point here with this is that, as men, we see kneeling as weak, right? We don't value that. So we don't build that muscle because your knees, I don't have the clinical language for it, but basically, like, building the muscle in your knees is not valued, but you recognize that good health, good physical health, part of that is the ability to kind of, your knees do so much for you, they hold you up. So emotionally, like, thinking of kneeling, the humility, the vulnerability, um, that's perceived as weakness, but really when you think about it, it's strength. It's about emotional agility, our emotional literacy. These are things that we need to work on to develop a whole sense of ourselves, a healthy sense of ourselves to handle all these upcoming challenges, things we're trying to navigate in society today. So yeah, so I think it's learning to value um, this idea of true strength, emotional health, emotional muscle building, and I think part of that is finding spaces like an emotional gym with your peers. You'd go with your buddies to work out, and you're a bit vulnerable with them because you might be performing for each other, but eventually you're kind of like, oh, I need to work on that, like my rep could be different. So emotionally doing that with each other, saying, yeah, like I need to work on this could be better. What do you think? Maybe we can getting like a professional trainer for your emotional self as a therapist, right? Or a counselor to help you sort through that. But yeah, it starts with accepting. It's not about me saying I'm not enough. It's saying what could be different, what could be better.
Jeff Perera, everybody. I could talk to Jeff for hours. Usually do. I have to cut myself off. You can check out Jeff's work or book him to speak to your community, campus, space, group, higherunlearning.com. Higherunlearning.com. Jeff, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be back after this break with brief final thoughts. We went long because, we're talking about men. I'm going to let the man talk. Back in a bit on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in the final moments of It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. Still mulling over what Jeff Perera was saying before the break and the beginnings of it being, instead of being I'm not good enough, what can I do better? That's an interesting pivot because we all hit points in our life where we feel beaten down. And I think a lot of people are feeling beaten down right now. And strangely, that's when ego kicks in. That's when we start going into denial, making excuses, doing that very performative thing. And I'm going to go back to the Barbie movie for a minute because this is a funny story about me. No, it's honestly funny. Not one of those funny stories people say is a funny story. It is just sad and pathetic. Okay, it kind of is. Because the character in the Barbie movie I related to most was Ken. Yes, Ryan Gosling's Ken. And this was a very self-aware moment for me and kind of painful because it reminded me of my days as a games journalist and being so singled out as a woman in that space. And in tech, the egos clash in different ways. It's sort of a passive-aggressive thing, so they're hard to spot. But Ryan Gosling's Ken's journey of always being the end, the supporting thing, the perpetual guest that no one really cared about, and you only had a good day if one of the people that really mattered looked at you kindly. And then you learn concepts like patriarchy, and you go kind of crazy and act like a lunatic for a while, and then you got to figure out what to do with yourself. And that's when you actually become an individual, and that's when you really find your center and find your voice. So that's where I'm going to leave on the idea of ego. It may be a social construct, but it doesn't just hit men. And next week, we'll be talking about women and imposter syndrome, because there is some ego in that too. Until then, Liana at nottherapyshow.com. If you want to drop me an email, nottherapyshow.com. If you just want to fill out our contact form, X, Instagram, and Threads. If you want to contact me there. And as usual, your crazy's only problem if it's hurting you. See you next time.